The Arizona Territory was a land that demanded blood for every drop of water. For Eliza Vance, isolated on her homestead, survival was a daily prayer. But that prayer is answered by a devil's bargain when she finds a man dying at her spring. He is not a settler. He is not a soldier. He is the most feared man in the territory, Geronimo. She chooses to save him, a secret that could hang her. But when a ruthless enemy threatens to burn her alive, Eliza learns that in the desert, a debt paid in blood is the only currency that matters. The sky over the Arizona Territory was not a comfort. It was a weight, an endless, bruised pewter expanse that pressed down on the small adobe cabin, threatening to crush it into the same dust that coated everything. Eliza Vance knew this weight in her bones. She felt it every morning when she stepped out onto the porch and looked east, her hand shading her eyes, searching for a rider who was now 5 days overdue. "He's fine, Eliza," she whispered to the cabin's empty doorway. "Tucson is just slow." But Tucson was a cauldron of sin, soldiers and scalp hunters, and her husband, Thomas Vance, was a good man, which made him a slow man in a fast, mean world. Their homestead was a hard Scrabble claim, chosen not for its beauty, but for its single, precious miracle. A spring. Tucked into a shallow arroyo and shaded by a knot of stubborn cottonwoods, the spring was the only reason they weren't skeletons rattling in the wind. It was also, she feared, the only reason they might one day become them. Water drew life, and life in this territory was often violent. Eliza was a woman of sturdy stock, with hands calloused from lye soap and tilling a garden that seemed determined to fail. She was not a natural pioneer. She was a woman from Ohio, who missed rain and green hills and the sound of neighbors. Tom was the dreamer, the one who saw an empire in 160 acres of rock and mesquite. She just saw the work. On the 6th day of Tom's absence, the heat was a physical blow. The air shimmered. Even the lizards lay panting in the slivers of shade. Eliza had just finished her morning chores, feeding the chickens, checking the patched fence of the goat pen, when she decided to fetch water from the spring. The walk was only a few hundred yards, but the silence was unnerving. The usual chatter of birds was gone. She carried 2 buckets, her bonnet low to shield her face. As she neared the cottonwoods, a new smell cut through the hot dust, a coppery, sour stench that turned her stomach. A coyote got a rabbit, she thought. She pushed through the reeds at the edge of the spring. It was not a rabbit. He was lying face down, half in the shallow water, his body a map of dried blood and fresh alkali mud. He was Apache. The breechcloth, the high moccasins, and the black matted hair told her that. He was also dying. Eliza dropped the buckets. The clang echoed in the sudden, terrible silence. Her first instinct was to run, to bar the cabin door and pray he died before he or his companions found her. This was the enemy. This was the spectre Tom and the men in Tucson whispered about, the reason she kept the shotgun loaded by the door. He groaned, a low, animal sound of pure agony. It wasn't a war cry, it wasn't a threat. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own pain. Eliza took a step back, her heart a trip hammer against her ribs. She looked at the sky, at the cabin, at the vast, empty horizon. There was no one. She was alone. He moved, trying to push himself up. His left shoulder was a ruin of bloody cloth and torn flesh, a bullet wound festering badly. He collapsed back into the mud, his breath a ragged, wet sound. "Oh God," she whispered. She could leave him. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He would be dead by sundown. But then he turned his head, just slightly. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of fevered pain, but he was still breathing. He was, beneath the blood and the fear he represented, just a man. Like her Tom, perhaps lost and dying somewhere. The thought cut her deeper than any knife. "Darn it all to heck," she muttered, the Ohio curse sounding weak and foolish in the brutal landscape. She looked at the sun, calculating. She had hours. She grabbed his arms, intending to drag him to the shade. He weighed nothing and everything. He was thin, were-like, but he was dead weight. She grunted, pulling him from the water. He was hot to the touch, burning with fever. She managed to get him under the largest cottonwood, his back against the trunk. He was unconscious, or close to it. His face was sharp, angular, with a high-bridged nose and a cruel, thin mouth, now slack with pain. He looked old and young, and timeless. She ran back to the cabin, her mind racing. The shotgun was by the door, a tempting, simple solution. But she didn't grab it. She grabbed the whiskey bottle, the small box of her mother's remedies, and a pail of clean water from the rain barrel. She tore a strip from her own petticoat. When she returned, his eyes were open. They were not the eyes of a dying man. They were black, sharp, and full of a terrible ancient fire. He did not move, but his gaze pinned her. It held surprise, suspicion, and a bottomless, chilling hatred. I'm not," she stammered, holding up the water and the rag. Water. His eyes tracked her every move. She knelt, terrified, 6 feet away. "This is for the wound." She held up the whiskey. He watched her. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of a fly. "I am alone," she said, the words feeling like a confession. "My husband is gone." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe to reassure him, or to tell herself. His eyes narrowed. He knew what that meant. She was vulnerable. She took a breath. "You can kill me when you're able, or you can let me help you. Either way, you'll die in this heat without water." She placed the pail of water on the ground and pushed it toward him with her foot. It scraped the dry earth. He watched it, then looked back at her. For a full minute, he did nothing. Then, with a slow, agonizing movement that contorted his face in pain, he reached with his good arm, dipped the rag she'd dropped, and brought the soaking cloth to his lips. The covenant was made. The man's name, she would learn later, was not one she could pronounce. But the name the settlers and soldiers had given him was one she knew well. It was a name spoken with a mix of terrified awe and spit. Geronimo. She didn't know this yet. To her, he was just the man, a dangerous secret she was now bound to. She could not leave him by the spring. Tom could return. A wandering patrol could see the buzzards that would inevitably gather. She had to move him. "You have to walk," she said, standing over him. He looked at her as if she were insane. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "I can't carry you. The cabin, it's too open, the cellar." Their cabin had a small root cellar, dug into the earth beneath the kitchen floor, accessed by a thick trapdoor. It was cool, dark, and most importantly, hidden. She pointed toward the cabin. "There, casa." She used the simple Spanish she'd picked up. "Food. Agua." He understood. He used the trunk of the cottonwood to try and stand. The effort was catastrophic. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound that was quickly strangled, and fell to his knees, his face ashen. The wound in his shoulder had ripped open, and fresh, dark blood pulsed through the muddy rags. Eliza acted without thinking. She was no longer a terrified woman. She was a nurse, a role her mother had drilled into her. "Hold still." She ripped more cloth from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound. He seized, his entire body locking from the pain, his good hand shooting out and grabbing her wrist. His grip was iron. It was not a threat. It was a reflex, a drowning man's grasp. She didn't flinch. "It's all right, just hold on." She held the pressure for long, agonizing minutes. His eyes were inches from hers, burning with fever and a raw, untamed humanity. She saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes, the grey tint of blood loss beneath his copper skin. He was not a demon. He was flesh. When the bleeding slowed, she helped him. It was a humiliating, agonizing journey. He leaned on her. She half dragged him. Every few steps he had to stop, his breath tearing from his lungs. It took them nearly an hour to cross the 300 yards. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both slick with his blood and her sweat. She pulled him through the door, and he collapsed onto the plank floor. "The cellar!" she gasped, pointing. She pulled back the bearskin rug and lifted the heavy trap door. A puff of cool, earthy air came up. He looked at the dark hole, then at her. It was a tomb, a trap. "It's safe," she insisted. "Safe." He shook his head, pushing himself away, his hand fumbling for a knife that wasn't there. "No," Eliza said, her voice firm. "Look." She gestured to the window. "Soldiers, vaqueros. They come. They see you. You die. I die." She pointed to the cellar. "Safe." He understood the logic of enemies. With a look of profound distrust, he slid his legs into the hole and lowered himself down the short ladder, his bad arm dangling uselessly. He sat on the packed earth floor, among the sacks of potatoes and barrels of salted pork, and looked up at her. He was a king holding court in a dungeon. Eliza's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the items she gathered. She brought him a lantern, unlit, a jug of water, a tin cup, and the last of her bandages. She also brought the whiskey and her sharpest skinning knife. She climbed down. The air was thick and still. "This will hurt," she said, holding the knife. He braced himself against the wall. He did not want the whiskey. He tore a strip of leather from his moccasin and bit down on it. He looked at her and gave a single, sharp nod. Eliza's stomach roiled. She had only ever lanced boils and dressed cuts. This was deeper. The wound was ragged, the flesh around it purple and hot. "I have to clean it." She poured the whiskey straight into the gaping hole. Geronimo did not scream. His body went rigid, a silent, terrible tremor running through him. His eyes rolled back, but he did not pass out. He just endured. Eliza worked for an hour. She dug out fragments of cloth and, with the tip of the knife, a flattened piece of lead. The bullet. It had shattered against the bone. She cleaned it as best she could, packed it with a poultice of comfrey and yarrow her mother had taught her to use, and bound it tight. When she was done, she was soaked in sweat. He was pale, but his eyes were clear, and the fever seemed to have lessened, replaced by the white-hot intensity of the pain. She left him the water and a piece of jerky. She climbed the ladder. Before she closed the trap door, she looked down. He was watching her. He hadn't touched the food. "Rest," she said. She closed the heavy wooden door, and the world was split in two. There was the bright, hot, empty cabin, and there was the dark, cool earth beneath her feet, where the most dangerous man in Arizona lay bleeding. She put the bearskin rug back. She scrubbed the blood from her floor, and then she sat in her rocking chair, the loaded shotgun across her lap, and waited. She did not know who she was more afraid of, the Apache warrior in her cellar, or her husband coming home to find him. For 3 days, Eliza Vance lived a life balanced on a knife edge. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin and the secret it held. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters sent a jolt of ice through her veins. She performed her chores in a frantic, robotic state. She fed the chickens, she milked the goat, she tended the fire. And every few hours, she would find an excuse to be in the kitchen, lift the heavy trap door, and tend to her prisoner. He was a model of terrifying stillness. He never spoke. He sat with his back against the earthen wall, his legs crossed, enduring. The fever raged, and then, on the second day, it broke. She found him drenched in sweat, his breathing easier, the fiery heat of his skin cooled. The cellar smelled of earth, salted meat, and infection. She brought him broth she made from a scrawny chicken, and he drank it. She brought him fresh water, and he drank that too. She redressed the wound, which was starting to knit, the angry purple fading to a bruised red. Her mother's poultice was working. Their interactions were silent, ritualistic. She would descend. He would watch. His eyes were the only part of him that moved. They were black, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. They weren't grateful. They weren't hateful. They were assessing. He watched her hands as she worked, her face as she measured his fever. He was, she realized, studying her. On the third afternoon, a storm blew in from the south, a violent early monsoon that turned the sky to charcoal. The wind howled, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. It was a deluge, a blessing that filled her rain barrels, but also a terror. The arroyo where the spring was would be a raging, muddy torrent. She was in the kitchen, lighting a lantern against the midday gloom, when the trap door rattled. She froze. It rattled again, more insistently. She moved the rug, her heart in her throat. She lifted the door an inch. His face was there, looking up, his good hand on the ladder. He pointed to the floor of the cellar. Water. A dark, muddy puddle was spreading from the south wall. The flash flood was saturating the ground, forcing water into the cellar. It wasn't a flood, not yet, but it was seeping in, threatening her supplies, and more importantly, him. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a warrior or an enemy, but a trapped animal. He could not stay down there. Up, she said, her voice strained. Get up. He climbed the ladder, moving slowly, his bad arm held stiffly against his chest. He stood in her kitchen, a figure from another world. He was taller than she'd realized, lean and muscular. In the dim light of the cabin, he seemed to suck all the air from the room. He looked around, his eyes taking in the sparse furniture, the wood-burning stove, the rifle over the mantel. The storm raged outside, isolating them in their own small, tense world. Sit, she said, pointing to the small stool by the fire. He ignored her, walking instead to the window. He looked out at the lashing rain, his expression unreadable. He was scanning the horizon, even in the downpour. You're safe, she said. No one will be out in this. He turned to her. He walked to the shotgun by the door, the one she'd forgotten in her haste. He picked it up. Eliza's breath caught. This was it. This was how she died. He held it, testing its weight. He ran his good hand over the stock, the double barrels. He looked at her. Then he walked to the rifle over the mantel. Tom's prized 1873 Winchester. He touched that too. He was assessing her arsenal. He was assessing her. He put the shotgun back. He walked to the stove, where the pot of broth was simmering. He picked up a tin cup, ladled it full, and drank, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a statement. I am strong enough to take what I need. The bullet, he said. His voice was a revelation. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first word he had spoken. What? She stammerless. He tapped his wounded shoulder. The bullet. You took it? Yes. Why? The question hung in the air, more dangerous than the storm. Why? She had asked herself that 100 times. "You were dying," she said simply. "You were at my spring. You were a man." He stared at her. The Geronimo of legend, the butcher of settlers, the man whose name was a curse. He stared at this lone woman who had just given him the most honest and most foolish reason in the world. He nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. He seemed to accept this. He walked back to the stool by the fire, and, for the first time, he sat. He looked at the flames, a silent, powerful, and profoundly dangerous guest in her home. The storm raged for hours. They sat in silence, she in her rocker, he by the fire. The shared space was electric with tension. She mended a sock. He watched the fire. Just before dusk, the rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The clouds broke. A sliver of watery sunlight painted the cabin floor. He stood. "It's time," she said. She wasn't asking. He nodded. He went to the door. "Wait," Eliza said. She ran to her pantry. She grabbed a cured ham, a full sack of dried pinto beans, and a small bag of salt. She also grabbed the tin of her mother's salve. She put it all in a burlap sack. She held it out to him. He looked at the sack, then at her. He took it. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the latch. He looked back at her, his black eyes holding hers. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't smile. He just looked. He was memorizing her face. Then he opened the door and was gone. He didn't walk. He simply dissolved into the wet, grey landscape. One moment he was there. The next, the doorway was empty. Eliza let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 days. She leaned against the doorframe, her legs weak. She was alive. The secret was out of her house. But as she looked at the empty room, at the damp stool by the fire, she had a chilling premonition. The secret was not gone. It was just waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her husband Tom was finally, truly, on his way home. Tom Vance returned 2 days later, and he was not alone. Eliza saw the dust cloud long before she could make out the riders. Her heart leapt, first with relief, then with a cold, sharp dread. There were 2 horses. She stood on the porch, smoothing her apron, a welcoming smile plastered on her face, her insides a knot of fear. Tom rode up, his face cracked with sunburn and exhaustion, but he was beaming. "Eliza, by God, woman, it's good to see you." He swung down from his horse, a big, hearty man, and wrapped her in an embrace that smelled of horse sweat and whiskey. "And I brought company," he boomed, turning. "Look who I found in Tucson, aimless and drinking my profits." The second rider dismounted, more slowly. He was thinner than Tom, dressed in a dark, city-style suit that was out of place in the dust, and he wore his gun tied low. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Eliza, my dear," the man said, sweeping off his hat. "You are a sight for sore eyes, the last flower blooming in this God-forsaken garden." It was Silas Croft, Tom's cousin. Eliza's smile faltered. "Silas, what a surprise." "A good surprise, I hope," Silas said, taking her hand and brushing his lips against her knuckles. His touch was cold. "Tom, he has been singing your praises, and I had to come see the paradise he've carved out of the dirt." "It's hardly a paradise," Eliza said, retrieving her hand, "but it's home. Come in, both of you. You must be starved." Tom was ecstatic. "Silas is thinking of buying a claim nearby. We could be neighbors, Liza. Imagine that." Eliza imagined it. The thought turned the bread in her stomach to lead. She had met Silas only once, at her wedding, and she had not liked him. He was a man who watched everything, who listened too much and said too little. Where Tom was open and loud, Silas was quiet and sharp. He was a man, she'd heard, who'd made his money in transport and land speculation, which, in the territory, could mean anything from prospecting to gun running. As she prepared a meal, fried salt pork, beans and fresh bread, the cabin felt smaller, hotter. Tom talked endlessly about his trip, the price of seed, the trouble with the cavalry, the new saloon. Silas sat at the small table, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes darting everywhere. He was a man who noticed things. "You've been busy, cousin," Silas said, his gaze landing on the shotgun by the door. "Expecting trouble?" "Always," Eliza said quickly, her back to him as she worked the stove. "Coyotes have been bold." "Coyotes?" he repeated, his voice silky. "Of course." Tom, oblivious, laughed. "My Eliza's tougher than she looks. Aren't you, love?" Later, as Tom was outside tending to the horses, Silas moved through the small cabin. He was like a cat, his movements economical and silent. He stopped at the kitchen area. He looked at the floorboards, at the bare skin rug. "This is a fine, sturdy cabin, Eliza. Tom has done well. A good floor, no drafts." "We manage," Eliza said, her hands tight in her apron. He nudged the rug with the toe of his boot. "Heavy. Good for keeping the cold out." He looked up at her. "Or keeping things in." Eliza's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." "No?" He smiled. "It's just this whole place. It smells of industry." He picked up the near-empty bottle of whiskey from the counter, the one she'd used on the wound. "Tom must have been thirsty on his way in." "He was," Eliza lied. "Strange," Silas said, holding it to the light. He was complaining in Tucson that he'd been dry for a month. He set the bottle down. The click of glass on wood was as loud as a gunshot. "And this," he said, walking to her small shelf of herbs and remedies. He picked up the small empty tin that had held her mother's comfrey salve. "My aunt, your mother, swore by this. For deep wounds, I recall. I use it for all sorts," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "Chapped hands. The goat had a cut." "Ah, the goat." Silas's eyes glittered. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have a secret, Eliza. I can smell it. It's a scent stronger than lye soap and fear. It smells like blood, and it smells like lies." He stepped back as Tom clumped onto the porch. "Well, I think I'll take a walk to that famous spring of yours. A man needs to wash the trail off him." "Tom can show you." No, Silas interrupted. "Tom's busy. You tell me. Just down the arroyo, by the cottonwoods?" "Yes," Eliza whispered, trapped. "I'm sure I can find it." He put on his hat, gave her a thin-lipped smile, and walked out the door, whistling. Eliza ran to the window. She watched him walk, not like a man seeking water, but like a tracker. He wasn't looking at the spring. He was looking at the ground. He was scanning for tracks, for turned-over rocks, for broken branches. He was hunting. And he knew, she realized with dawning horror, that something had been there. He was just looking for the trail. The homestead, once her refuge, became her prison. Silas Croft's presence was a poison that seeped into everything. He was a shadow at her table, a serpent in her small garden. He was, ostensibly, there to survey the land. He spent his days riding, disappearing for hours, only to return at dusk, his face inscrutable. He was charming to Tom, plying him with whiskey and the tales of land booms in California. "This little spring is the key, Tom," Silas would say, throwing an arm around his cousin. "A man who controls this water controls the whole valley, but it's a small claim. Too small for a real ranch." "It's enough for us," Tom said, but Eliza could see the seed of ambition Silas was planting. "For now," Silas would hedge, "but the Apaches, They're thick as fleas out here. A man with a wife. It's a dangerous place. Maybe you'd be better off in Tucson, or even back east." He was trying to buy them out. That's what this was. But it was his interactions with Eliza that were the most terrifying. He'd find her alone, by the chicken coop or the woodpile. "I found a spot by the spring," he said one morning, casually, as he cleaned his fingernails with a long, sharp knife. "Down by the water's edge. Looks like someone butchered a deer there. A lot of disturbance." "I told you," Eliza said, her voice tight. "Coyotes." "Right, coyotes." He smiled. "Funny thing, though. I found this." He held up a small, dark object. It was a single bead, made of polished stone and sinew. It was Apache. Eliza's breath hitched. It must have fallen from Geronimo's moccasin or breechcloth. "Dropped by a coyote, no doubt," Silas mused, rolling the bead between his thumb and forefinger. "You know, Eliza, I was with a cavalry patrol just north of here, about a week back. We were tracking a small war band, had a skirmish, wounded their leader." He looked up, his eyes boring into hers. He was a big one, too. The one they all fear. The one they call Geronimo. Eliza felt the ground fall away. This was the twist. Silas wasn't just a land grabber. He was the hunter. "He got away," Silas continued, his voice a low, cold monotone. "He was hit bad. In the shoulder, I heard. My bullet, I'd wager." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, dry air. A man wounded that badly. He couldn't have gone far. He'd need water. He'd need help. Someone to dig that bullet out. Someone to patch him up. He flicked the bead in the air and caught it. "You find a man like that on your land, Eliza, you're supposed to ring the bell. You're supposed to call the army, harboring him. Well, that's treason. That's a hanging offense, for the man who does it, and for his wife." Eliza was silent. She could not speak. "This is a fine claim, Tom," Silas announced at dinner that night. "But I've found a better one. The problem is, the Tucson Ring, the land syndicate I work for, they want this valley, and they want this spring. They've authorized me to make you a generous offer." Tom, who'd had too much of Silas's whiskey, looked intrigued. "Generous. $500, in gold, for the claim, the cabin, the livestock, everything." Tom whistled. "500! Liza, did you hear?" Eliza stared at her plate. "And if we say no?" Silas's smile vanished. "Then the land is declared contested territory. The syndicate will file a claim that Tom's paperwork is fraudulent. And while that's being investigated, other complications might arise." "Is that a threat, Silas?" Tom said, his good nature finally cracking. "It's a fact, cousin," Silas said, leaning back. "This isn't Ohio. There's no law but the law you make, and my associates, they make a lot of law." "Get out," Tom said, standing up. "Tom!" Eliza cried. "No, I won't be threatened on my own land. Get out, Silas." Silas stood slowly. He looked at Tom, then at Eliza. His face was a mask of cold fury. "I see. It's her, isn't it? She's the one with the spine." He turned to Eliza. "I gave you a chance, Eliza. I really did." He walked to the door. "You have until dawn. Take the money, or don't. But I will tell you this. When the syndicate finds out, and I will tell them that this land was used to shelter the man who's been burning their supply wagons, they will not be gentle. They won't just take the land, Eliza. They'll cleanse it." He left. The sound of his horse's hoofbeats, galloping away, was drowned by the sudden, terrible silence in the cabin. Tom turned to his wife. His face was pale. "Eliza, what did he mean? Shelter who?" Eliza Vance looked at her husband, at the man she loved, at the small, fragile life they had built. And she knew she had to tell him. The confession was a whisper. It came out in ragged, broken pieces. The man at the spring, the fever, the cellar, the bullet. Tom listened, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to a deep, bone-chilling horror. "Geronimo," he whispered, his voice hoarse. You had him in our cellar. He was dying, Tom. He was just a man. A man, Tom roared, his voice cracking. "He's not a man, Eliza. He's a fire. He's a plague. He's the devil himself. And you invited him in. You saved him. God in heaven, Eliza, what have you done?" He backed away from her, as if she were the source of the infection. He looked at her hands, the hands that had tended the warrior. "He'll be back," Tom whispered, his eyes wide with a new, personal terror. "Silas, he's not just coming for the land. He's coming for us. He's coming to kill us for being traitors." Eliza ran to the door and barred it. She looked out the window into the deep, unforgiving twilight. "Tom," she said, her voice low and steady, all the fear burned away, replaced by a cold resolve. "He's not coming at dawn. He's coming now, and he's not alone." On the ridge, silhouetted against the dying light, were a dozen riders, and they were not soldiers. The night was a void. The riders on the ridge had vanished with the light, but Eliza and Tom knew they were still there. They were a ring of unseen, patient malice, tightening around the small cabin. "They're Silas's men," Tom said, his voice flat. He was checking the Winchester, his hands moving with practiced mechanical motions. Not syndicate men, not soldiers, just roughs. Hired guns from Tucson, men Lanky Pete and the like. "How many?" Eliza asked. She was at the other window, the shotgun heavy in her hands. "I counted 12, maybe 13. Tom slammed a cartridge into the chamber. "They're waiting. They'll want to rush us at first light, or burn us out." The cabin, once a symbol of security, now felt like a wooden coffin. Every knot in the wood, every chink in the adobe, was a potential weakness. "Eliza," Tom said, not looking at her. "What you did. Don't, Tom, not now. No, I need to say it." He turned, his face haggard in the moonlight streaming through the window. "It was brave. It was the bravest, most foolhardy, most Christian thing I've ever seen, and it's going to get us killed. He was a man, Tom. I know." He sighed, a sound of profound defeat. "I know. I wish he'd picked someone else's spring." The hours from midnight to 4 a.m. were the longest of their lives. They sat in the dark, taking turns watching. The silence of the desert was absolute. No crickets, no owls, even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. The attack came not at dawn, but in the grey, watery false light that precedes it. It wasn't a charge. It was a single, piercing yell. "Traitors!" followed by the explosion of gunfire. A bullet smashed through the window, sending a spray of glass and wood splinters across the room. Eliza screamed, dropping to the floor. "Stay down!" Tom yelled. He fired the Winchester toward a muzzle flash near the goat pen. A man cried out in pain or anger. "They're in the arroyo!" Tom shouted. "And by the woodpile!" Gunfire erupted from 3 sides. The cabin was being peppered. Bullets thudded into the thick adobe walls, but the wooden door and shutters were splintering. "They're trying to pin us!" Tom crawled to the other window, shoved the barrel of the rifle through the broken shutter, and fired again. "Eliza, the back!" Eliza scrambled to the cabin's small rear window, the one that looked out over her failed garden. She could see shadows moving, low and fast, near the chicken coop. "They're coming, Tom!" She lifted the shotgun, her arms shaking so badly she could barely aim. She saw a man, his face a pale smudge in the dark, rise up from behind the rain barrel. She pulled both triggers. The shotgun's roar was deafening in the small space. The recoil sent her staggering back. The man screamed, a high, wet sound, and fell. "Good girl!" Tom yelled, a note of wild pride in his voice. But the yell was premature. As he cheered her, he exposed himself for a second too long at the front window. A rifle cracked from the ridge, a much heavier caliber than the others. "Silas!" Tom grunted, a sound like a man being punched in the chest. He collapsed, falling away from the window. "Tom!" Eliza was at his side in an instant. He was clutching his shoulder, the same shoulder she had just seen. No, it was his left shoulder. Blood was everywhere, dark and thick in the lamplight she'd lit. It's just the shoulder, Liza," he gasped, his face white with shock. I'm all right. Get down," she ordered, her voice iron. She pushed him against the wall, below the window line. She grabbed a strip of linen from her sewing box. "They're coming," Tom choked out as she packed the wound. "They'll rush us. Let them." She spat, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. Outside, the shooting stopped. A new, more terrible sound began, the crackle of fire. "Smoke 'em out, boys!" It was Silas's voice, clear and triumphant. "Burn the traitor's nest!" Eliza smelled it first. Kerosene. Then smoke. It was coming from the north wall, the one with no windows. They had stacked brush against it. "He's burning the cabin," Tom whispered, his eyes wide with horror. The smoke began to pour through the chinks in the wall. It was acrid and thick. Within a minute, the room was fogged. "We have to go," Eliza said, coughing, pulling Tom to his feet. "Where?" he gasped. "We open that door, they'll cut us in two. We die here, or we die out there. I choose out there." She grabbed the Winchester and helped Tom limp to the front door. The heat from the north wall was already blistering. The roof beams were starting to groan. "They've stopped shooting," Tom coughed. "They're just waiting. Waiting for us to run." Eliza looked through a crack in the splintered door. She could see them. Silas and his men, maybe 10 of them left, formed a loose semicircle, their rifles raised, their faces lit by the growing flames of the cabin. They were enjoying this. "On 3, she said, her hand on the bar. "Eliza, I love you," Tom breathed. "I know," she said. She was about to lift the bar. This was the end. And then a new sound. It was not a gunshot. It was not the wind. It was a horn, a single, high-pitched, terrifying note like the cry of a hawk. Silas and his men heard it. They stopped laughing. They looked up. "What in the hell?" one of them said. Eliza looked through the crack. She, too, looked up at the ridge. The eastern sky was just beginning to turn a pale, bloody red, and silhouetted against it, as if they had risen from the earth itself, were riders. Not 12, not 20, 50, 100, maybe more. They were motionless, a wall of silent horsemen, their lances and rifles stark against the new day. They were Apache, and at their head, on a black and white pinto, was a man. He was not wearing a shirt. His left shoulder was wrapped in a crude bandage. He just sat, watching the burning cabin. "God," Tom whispered from the floor. He came back." "No," Eliza said, her eyes locked on the figure. "He was already here. He was hunting Silas." Silas and his men were frozen. They were caught between the burning cabin of the traitors and the Apache war band that had materialized from their worst nightmares. One of Silas's men, lanky Pete, threw his rifle down. "I ain't doing this," he said, and he put his hands in the air. Another man bolted, running for the horses. He was met by 3 Apache riders who seemed to simply appear in his path. He didn't even have time to scream. Silas's posse dissolved. It wasn't a fight, it was a surrender. Men threw down their weapons, begging. But the Apache warriors were not looking at them. They were looking at their leader. Geronimo rode his horse down the incline. He did not charge. He walked it, slowly, deliberately, through the center of the cowering, terrified gunmen. He rode past them as if they were stones. He rode until he was 20 yards from the cabin door and 20 yards from Silas Croft, who was now alone, his pistol shaking in his hand. Silas looked at the burning cabin, then at the wall of warriors, then at the man he had come to kill. Geronimo stopped. He looked at Silas. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stared. Silas Croft, the speculator, the land grabber, the killer, was a man who understood odds, and the odds had just turned against him in the most profound way possible. He let out a sound, a high-pitched, pathetic whine. He dropped his pistol, scrambled onto his horse, and kicked it into a frantic, panicked gallop, heading east. Geronimo watched him go. He let him. The other gunmen were rounded up, disarmed and bound with a silent, terrifying efficiency. The cabin was now an inferno. "The roof!" Tom cried. Eliza threw the bar off the door and kicked it open, dragging her wounded husband out onto the porch just as the main beam collapsed in a shower of sparks. She and Tom fell onto the dusty ground, coughing, blinded by the smoke and the sudden, brilliant dawn. They were surrounded. The Apache warriors formed a wide, silent circle around them. Eliza stood, her body aching, her nightgown and hair singed, her face black with soot. She held the empty shotgun. Geronimo walked his horse up to her. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the burning wreck of her home. He looked at the bound, terrified gunmen. He looked at the wounded Tom, who was trying to stand. Then his gaze settled on Eliza. His face was stone. There was no gratitude. There was no anger. There was just an acknowledgement, a closing of a circle. He raised his good hand, not in a wave, but with his palm open. A sign. Debt paid. Then he turned his horse. He gave a single sharp command in his own tongue. His warriors pulled the captured men onto horses. They were prisoners. Their fate would be decided elsewhere. Within 5 minutes, they were gone. The entire war band, their prisoners and their leader, vanished back into the arroyo, into the hills, as if they had been a dream. Eliza and Tom were left alone in the sudden, shocking silence, standing in the dust, watching the sun rise over the smoking ashes of their home. The sun rose high, baking the new ruins. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air. Eliza and Tom did not speak for a long time. They simply sat, huddled on the porch of their burned-out lives, Tom's head on Eliza's lap as she bound his wound with the last clean strip of cloth she possessed. The goat, miraculously unharmed, bleated from its pen. "He let Silas go," Tom finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "Silas wasn't the point," Eliza said. She was watching the tracks her savior had left, already being erased by the morning wind. His men, the ones who hunted him, they were the point. Silas was just a coward. Letting him run was a worse punishment. He would have to go back to the Tucson ring and explain how he'd lost a dozen men and a prime piece of land to a single Apache warband. He was a ruined man. "What he did," Tom said, "he didn't do it for us. He did it for himself." "He did it," Eliza said, "because he pays his debts, and I paid mine." She had saved a man. He had, in turn, saved her. The transaction was complete. The balance sheet of the desert was clean. They were alive, but the homestead was gone. The cabin was a pile of smouldering timber. Their supplies were ashes. Their empire was a 160-acre patch of scorched earth. "We can't stay," Tom said. It wasn't a question. No. They both knew it. The story would get out. Silas would talk, twisting the narrative to paint them as the traitors, the Apache lovers who had brought the Red Death down on his innocent posse. The army would come. They would have questions Eliza could not answer. And even if they didn't, every settler, every traveler would look at them with suspicion. They were tainted. And more than that, the land itself was tainted. The spring, once a source of life, now felt like a place of ghosts. It had drawn both the desperate and the greedy. They spent the day salvaging what they could. Not much. A cast-iron skillet. A few tools from the shed which hadn't burned. Tom's rifle, its stock charred. They packed what they could onto their single remaining horse. The other, and the mule, had been stolen or scattered. They left the goat. "She'll be fine," Eliza said, untying the pen. "The spring is here. She's a survivor. This is her land now." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same bloody colors as the dawn, they stood by the trail. Tom, his arm in a sling, looked at the ashes. "All that work," he said, his voice thick with loss. "It was just wood," Eliza replied, though her heart ached for her small, safe home. "We're alive, Tom. We're alive." He looked at his wife, at the soot on her face, the strength in her eyes. He had married a woman from Ohio. He was leaving with a woman from the Arizona Territory. "Where to?" he asked. Eliza looked west, toward the setting sun, toward California, toward anything that wasn't this. West. Somewhere. Green. Somewhere it rains. Tom nodded. He pulled himself onto the horse, and then reached down and pulled Eliza up to sit in front of him. They didn't look back. They rode away from the spring, from the ashes, from the terrible, beautiful, and brutal covenant they had made and paid for. The story of the Vance siege was told in Tucson saloons for years. It was twisted and turned, a dark legend. Some said the Vances were in league with the Apaches. Others said they were murdered, their ghosts still haunting the springs. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that, in a small, quiet valley in Northern California, a woman with calloused hands and haunted eyes would sometimes wake in the night, smelling smoke. She would go to the window, not to look for riders, but to look at the rain and be thankful. And no one knew that, deep in the Dragoon Mountains, a warrior named Geronimo would sometimes hold a small, empty salve tin, a strange token from a battle he had won, long before the real siege had ever begun. That, my friends, is the story of the Frontier Wife's Covenant. It's a reminder that the West wasn't just won by gunfire and gold, but by impossible choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary, desperate times. Eliza Vance stood at the crossroads of two worlds, and in a single act of compassion, she changed her fate, and the fate of the man they called a devil. What do you think? Was Eliza a hero or a traitor? What would you have done in her place? If this story made you feel the grit and the heat of the Arizona Territory, please hit that like button. It lets me know you want more tales from the Wild West. And share this video with someone who loves a good dramatic story. Most importantly, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We have a lot more forgotten legends and dark histories to uncover, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.